Okay, everywhere you turn, you hear calls for greater accountability. And I'm not going to take a stand against all accountability, not against accountable political parties, for example, or against accountability in corrupt regimes. But I'm going to argue against the wholesale application of what I think is a flawed model of what gets the best results. So to be clear at the outset, when I speak of accountability, I mean an understanding of accountability that's now relatively hegemonic in the discipline of political science. Namely, that to hold an agent accountable means imposing sanctions if he or she does not do a good job. And to say that someone is not accountable means that they're relatively impervious to sanctions. For example, if anyone here is familiar with the volume put out by Adam Jaworski and Susan Stokes and Bernard Manin on accountability about 10 years ago, that's the meaning that they use. That's the book that most people use when they say teach accountability. They'll be using that book. That's what they use. That's their model. And that's the model I'm going to argue today is flawed. So this is the outline of my talk. First, I'm going to briefly describe that Jaworski, Stokes, and Manin model, what I call the sanction model. That's the standard understanding of principal-agent relationships based on what was the hegemonic economic model about a decade or so ago and what is now still the dominant model. And then I'll describe an alternative principal-agent relationship, which I'll call the selection model. And that model is possible only in certain specific circumstances. And I'll show how the standard principal-agent relationship based on sanctions fits the standard understanding of accountability and how that's sometimes counterproductive. And I'll show how the alternative relationship based on selection fits an alternative understanding of accountability and how when that relationship is possible, it's both more efficient and more morally satisfying. And then I'll talk about the implications of those two forms of principal-agent relationship. One implication being that sometimes that this reigning assumption in political science, which some of you may share, that competition is good. I'm going to be sort of arguing that sometimes that's wrong, and that incumbency, long incumbencies are bad. I'm going to argue that sometimes that's wrong. And another implication is that the many calls you hear for transparency, more transparency, more transparency, that those themselves may be wrong. And then finally, I'll look at the pitfalls in this alternative that I'm suggesting. The selection model is not an ideal. I'm not holding this up as a normative ideal. I am saying that it does have some good normative properties, and it can be efficient in appropriate circumstances for reasons that I've shown. But it has significant pitfalls as well. So, of course, in many cases in world history, the selection of a leader because of assumed similarity of interests can be a facade for corruption and actual divergence of interests. And sometimes the selected representative himself may genuinely see himself as one thing, compassionate conservative, for example, but then he may turn out to be another thing, especially if he evolves over time, a neoconservative, for example. And sometimes, no matter what he says, people may attach their fantasies to a selected representative and then be deceived. And sometimes a person can be a perfect gyroscopic representative on one issue, let's say New Labour, and be selected on that dimension. Tony Blair was New Labour. He was New Labour in his heart. He was New Labour in his blood. He was New Labour from tip to toe. He was a perfect selected gyroscopic representative. He was New Labour. And then along came the Iraq War. And who knew that he was going to do that? And it was justice from within. But people had selected him on dimension A, and now dimension B becomes very salient. So at that point, of course, in the selection model, you remove the continuing. I mean, Tony Blair says to this day, I was right about Iraq, I would do it again, etc. He's a complete selection model guy, you know, Iraq, I was right, but the system removed it, put in somebody else. So the system's working perfectly well. The system did not work by threatening Tony Blair, it threatened the party with non-re-election. So So when you're asking about selection model and sanction model, this applies to parties as well as individuals when you're thinking through this process. So, to sum up, the selection model is not perfect, but its defects may not always be appropriately remedied by simply moving over to a sanctions model. So I'm suggesting a more contextual approach, that we recognize that when you're looking to say selection model sanction, how much of one or the other, I've been talking about them as if they were dichotomies, but I began, of course, by saying there's a selection of core and sanction periphery, and that can be of different sizes. When you're trying to figure out what kind of system is appropriate for a particular set of circumstances, all I'm asking is that you recognize the significant costs of monitoring and sanctioning. You recognize the efficiency and the moral values of a selection model. Not to say that it's an ideal, but it can be efficient and it can have certain moral values. And recognize the specific pitfalls of a selection model and work on those problems. Don't just throw the model out. And depending on the circumstances, you just ask how large the selection core and how large the sanction periphery should be, and enough already of more calls for just more accountability.